Amen.
I might just have you read this whole sermon, actually. Might be way more interesting. Thank you. Morning, friends. How you guys doing? Happy Easter. It's good to see y'all. For the sake of time, it takes a long time to put some flowers on a tree, doesn't it? I knew. It's easier to get them out of the earth than to put them back in. So why don't we take just 3 deep breaths together, and then we'll move into whatever you call this next part. Talky, teachy, listen-y. Let's breathe. All right. So we're going to begin here. We have to go back in time. It's Easter, but we're going to start at the cross with part 1, which is titled The Crucified God. This is 1 Corinthians 1, 22, 23. This is St. Paul, and he writes, you can just hear his sort of like, fatigue, I feel like. It's like Jews demand signs, and Greeks, they want wisdom. But this is what we got. We preach Christ crucified. And as it turns out, this is a stumbling block, not only to the Jews, but it's a problem for the Gentiles too. He calls it foolishness to the Greeks. There's a podcast available, wherever it is that you get your podcast from, called Greeking Out. And we stumbled upon it some time ago, and I've now heard, I think, every Greek myth. It's like National Geographic. It's for kids. It's great. It's a great show. And so me and my 2 sons have spent untold hours going through all the Greek myths. And honestly, to be honest, like having grown up with like Aesop's fables or something, I'm not sure where I got the feeling that each of these stories should have a really clean like moral application that I would immediately begin to understand and resonate with, because they didn't. Like I thought, oh man, this culture valued some very different things than the things I grew up understanding to value, though its imprint of, Rome, Greece, is obviously like all over the Western world, the United States. So you listen to these myths and you pretty quickly realize that the concept of a God, who would willingly submit to the humiliation of crucifixion at the hands of puny mortals, right, would make no sense. Like, does not compute. It barely computes to us. It certainly wouldn't compute back then. The gods of the Greek and Roman pantheon were powerful, and they were courageous, and they were kind of petty for a little while. It's like God's behaving badly. It takes a minute, especially Zeus, man. This guy gets out of everything. It's always somebody else's fault. And he's the one, he's the king of kings. It's problematic. The values that end up being elevated in these stories, if you do look for a moral to the story, were like valor and persuasion and persistence. But I haven't heard one yet that held up self-sacrificial love, especially because there's no such thing as self-sacrificial love without surrender, which was kind of the antithesis of what was going on at the time. A crucified God would have made no sense. I just want to say I can confirm what this Bible verse says. I checked it out, weighed it against a podcast. Isn't that what you're supposed to do? The crucified God. This is a phrase that was coined by a guy named Jürgen Moltmann. He was a big theologian there a couple decades ago. And he was a soldier, and he was in the German army he'd been captured. He was a prisoner of war in England. And while he was there, he was given a copy of the New Testament, which he had never read before. And He writes that when he read Jesus cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" His immediate thought was, "Oh, here's somebody who understands me." What the cross can do, is really challenge our conception of God as omniscient, as all-powerful, as watching us from a distance. Recently been to a Bon Iver concert. The cross challenges our conception of God as omniscient, all-powerful. The cross reveals to us, that somehow God, who created all things, is above and in, also suffers. That our suffering is also God's suffering, and that God's suffering is also our suffering. That we are united to each other and to God in mysterious ways, but one of the most life-changing, tangible, paradigm-shifting ways is when the realization settles in on us that all pain is the same pain. It's just dressed up in different clothes. And I wonder if you've noticed this already, that all pain is the same pain. All suffering is the same suffering. It just goes around in different clothing. There's the guy arguing with himself outside the mission house. There's the lonely middle school student. There's the guilt-ridden executive. All these characters. There's the criminals on either side of the cross. There's Christ in between them. And all share the same pain, all united in suffering. And this recognition, noticing this, beginning to experience this, it's where compassion comes from. It's the place, this seeing is where compassion arises from. Because what we begin to notice is that we're one in suffering. We're not that different, you and I. And we're also united in love. These are the two things, maybe, that reveal it most clearly. And when we consciously participate in this mystery, because it is a mystery, but when we consciously participate in it, what I experience is Christ in you, coming in love to Christ in me, and while I'm suffering. And when it's Christ in you, and coming in love to me, to Christ in me, while I'm suffering, what happens is it obliterates all of the power structures, all the hierarchies. It just explodes the whole thing. There's no more person of privilege sort of reaching down from their comfortable place to help out for a minute the person in need. There's no person in need groveling at the feet of the ones who maybe could help them. That's all part of what happens here on one level, but at this deeper level, it's Christ in you coming to Christ in me, and the ground levels and the hierarchies dissolve. And we experience what happens when our ego finally quiets down. The part of us that's like, I want, I have to, oh no, that wasn't quite what I needed. I want, oh, maybe one more of those. This part. And then also the part of us that's like, I could fix this. A little adjustment here, a little adjustment. They've just been doing it wrong. I'll fix poverty, just give me a little bit of time. That ego, when it does finally quiet down from this kind of seeing, this connection, what we experience is agape love. The Greeks had a good word for it, agape love, which is selfless love. But it might be more properly pronounced love, less self. And so I don't want to bore anybody by overstating the point, but the logo, Christianity chose a weird logo. The Flash has got the lightning bolt, Thor's got the hammer. Christianity's got the cross, which we're all used to now, but it's just for torture, It's like having an electric chair up on the stage. What's going on there? The the central image of Christianity is a dying, bleeding, losing man. It's not an empty tomb. Like, what? And so, stay with that for as long as you'd like. What came to my mind immediately is just that the cross reminds us to not so easily or thoughtlessly, trust our assumptions and our definitions of what it is to win in this life and what it is to lose in this life and what it is to label any of those things. Like the cross is here to say, So I want to read just a little part of this poem. It's by Rainer Maria Rilke. It's called The Man Watching. And he says, and may we remember this, what we choose to fight, the things we choose to fight, are so tiny. But what fights with us is so great. If only we would let ourselves be dominated as things do by some immense storm, then we would become strong too, and not need names. When we win, it's with the small things, and the winning itself makes us small. And winning does not tempt that man. Winning does not tempt that man. This is how he grows. By being defeated decisively, by constantly greater things. And this brings us to part two. Part two is titled, A Tale of Two Perspectives. Tale of Two Perspectives. I only have 11 parts, so don't worry. We'll be through this. Then there's the subparts, but... All right, so about 1,000 years ago, in 1054, the Eastern Christian Church, which is called the Orthodox Church, and the Western Roman Catholic Church split decisively. They'd had enough. It had been brewing for a long time, a couple hundred years. 1054, they had enough. They split decisively. The Western Pope excommunicated the Eastern Patriarch, who then returned the favor by excommunicating the Pope. Like, hey, I already excommunicated you. You can't do that. It's been called the Great Schism. Have you heard of this? It's kind of a fun word, the Great Schism. And reflecting on this, I was reminded, there's this weird little historical pattern in the church. I'm sure it's outside the church too, but just in if I'll just stay in my wheelhouse. About every 500 years, something radical happens. 500 years before Jesus came the prophets. It was like 400 years of silence. Where our calendar starts, where we're living, came Jesus, right? The Roman Empire fell, and the Dark Ages began around 400 or 500. The Great Schism that we're going to talk about here was at 1,000. And then there was the Protestant Reformation in 1500, which more familiar with that. So about every 500 years, something dramatic happens here within the church. There's some kind of shakeup. I've heard it called a rummage sale. The church is just off-selling things that... And so I don't know if that brings you if things have felt kind of weird at the church, like the capital C church, for a little while now, and maybe it has. This, for me at least, frames it in a context that I can understand. Like, it looks like we're just kind of due for a shakeup. It's like clockwork in some way. Now, if we get back to the Great Schism, all right, are you ready for this? And I don't mean to make light of this. I wasn't there. As far as I can tell, I wasn't there. And I'm sure there's a lot more that went into this, but this is how history records the main reason that this split finally occurred. It was a theological disagreement. It's a little bit of a shocker, I know. I want to pause. The church, as far as I can look into church history, as much as I have not found evidence of the church ever splitting over issues like care for the poor. There was never a branch of the church that said, you know what, those people are on their own. I think we've gotten close here lately, but those people are on their own. We're going to do church, but without caring for the poor people. It's like almost never been about lived life. And it's always about what's going on in here, these theological issues, split and divide. All right, so Great Schism, theological disagreement. And it was about whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father, which is what the Eastern Church believed, or from the Father and the Son. So around the Trinity. Do they have they shared rights to the Spirit, or was it just from the Father? And that was enough in that split, and when it seems, at least to me, kind of reminded me of, like, do you know when you've gotten into an argument and you've been at it for a little while, and then it starts to like dawn on you that actually you're wrong, and your position is untenable, but you're in too deep now to and all you got, I got my reasons. Why? Just don't understand. Like, I kind of feel like, so I don't know. They split. Orthodox Church, Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Church, Western Church. This mutual excommunication that occurred in 1054 remained until 1965. 1,000 years of little to no communication between the Church of the East and the Church of the West. 1,000 years. And little to no curiosity from the common folk, but plenty of animosity and skepticism, because if it's not like us, then we better be afraid, that kind of. Little to no communication about how the tradition was developing within itself, just the Christian tradition, what was shifting and changing within itself. So after roughly 1,000 years, Pope Paul VI, the Patriarch, this is fun, Athenagoras the First, presided over simultaneous ceremonies that revoked the excommunication decrees. And I think really it was just because it was the 60s, man. It was like, they're working it out. So a lot can happen in 1,000 years. Think about your life in the last 3 years and how you've changed. Now think of the millions of people engaging these texts and engaging in community with each other and shaping and forming one another, being shaped and formed by what they read and by what they experienced of God for 1,000 years with almost no communication. So the Western Church and the Eastern Church ended up, of course, arriving at some different understandings. And this is where I'm getting to. You guys might be like, I didn't sign up for a church history class. I couldn't be here to hear about Jesus. It's Easter. Goodness gracious. The Western Church and the Eastern Church arrived at some different understandings that I think actually are pretty complementary to each other of what the resurrection of Christ really means. What does it mean? Now, art appreciation was the only class that I regularly attended when I was in community college. Okay? When I figured out that they were not keeping attendance like they did in high school, I was kind of like, well, I might head over to the library and do a little solo reading instead of going to that algebra class. But I never missed art appreciation. I loved it. And so I feel uniquely prepared to now lead us through a study exploring the visual representations of the resurrection of Jesus. Right, now, the art that a culture produces obviously reveals not just what's going on at like the conscious level where we agree, but the art reveals what's going on underneath, the deep stuff. And so to understand these kind of different perspectives, we're going to take a look at a series of images, and we're going to start with the Western Church. So a guy named John Dominic Crossan, a scholar, is how I heard about this, and he has a book called Resurrecting Easter, if you want to look at this a little bit more. It's really interesting, and it has colored pictures. All right, in nearly all Western art, I'm going to turn so I can see. Oh, sorry, guys. So in nearly all Western art depicting the resurrection, Jesus emerges from the grave triumphantly and magnificently. And in some images like this one, like the guards looks like this getting blown back, kind of by the power of what's happening here. There he is. This one, sometimes it shows them sleeping, sometimes it shows them awake, sometimes it shows them cowering, covering their heads in fear, which honestly, if that happened to you, you just put the guy to death, you roll the thing out, and then he comes walking back out at you. In some of the depictions, Christ is surrounded by angels, this one here. But in nearly all Western images of the resurrection, Christ is he's totally alone. He just comes out by himself, which makes sense. He went in by himself. So he's alone as he emerges, which would not be unusual unless we had the Eastern tradition to balance this image against. And what we find in the Eastern Orthodox is that the images of the resurrection, Christ is shown emerging from the realm of the dead, holding onto the arms of Adam and Eve, usually by the wrist. And many believe Adam and Eve to be a symbolic stand-in for all of humanity. They're our shared parents. And what Christ does is he leads them out of the grave. He brings them out of their graves with him. And in some images, there's this whole parade of humanity that's following Christ out of the mouth of death. See that little monster over there? And this message begins to crystallize, and the message seems to be, when Christ stepped out of the tomb, so did you. And maybe this is why we respond so deeply to this story. There's something in us deeper than our minds that find grace so difficult to believe and accept. So understands there's something happening here in this story. The next image, in most of the images, we see this figure of Hades, who is the personification of death, and he's the gatekeeper of the prison of death, is what it was considered. And he's bound up and cowering and kind of creepy. And that's really what's happening here, that kind of creepy, is this fear of death. And what these images communicate is that this fear of death, our most profound fear, the most extreme example or conceptualization we can come up with for what separation feels like, to be separated from those we love in some ongoing way where there's no return. The separation to its extreme is death. And the message here, and it's all through the scriptures, they're trying to work it out in the New Testament, is that somehow in this resurrection, in this being incorporated into Christ, that we raise, and that it says, "O death, where is your sting?" The grave has been conquered. There is no separation. In most of the images, there's all these locks, and there's bolts, and there's all their weird-looking things. There's bars. There's always the gates to Hades have been cracked open and laid out in a cruciform shape. There's bolts and bars, and everything's broken. All of it looks busted. It's flying everywhere. And the representation here, that the message is that the power of sin, which always and only leads to death, it just goes to more. It comes from the fear of separation. It's where all our bad behavior comes from. We don't want to look at it. We don't want to feel it. We're afraid of it. And so we cover it up with distractions. We manipulate each other to try to get a little bit of pleasure. If you look deep enough into sin, what it feels like and what it does, it comes from a place of separation, and it continues the feeling of separation. And so it leads to death. Here in the message of the cross and the resurrection is that this power, the power of sin, has been destroyed. It's all broken and fallen around us. We're so familiar with what it feels like to be driven and dictated by our compulsions that it takes a little while. It takes some time for our minds to be renewed, for us to surrender and surrender and surrender and surrender and keep, till we begin to experience the truth of our freedom. When Jesus died on the cross, he said, "It is finished," which to me feels like the message is we don't have to keep living like it isn't. And so what's left to do, this renewing of the mind, a big part of it seems to be just identifying our own compulsions, identifying our own places and feelings and experiences of alienation, like just starting to get to know ourselves, to see where the patterns come from, to see what voices we're listening to. Have you ever heard yourself thinking and been like, oh my God, that is so mean? Do you know what I mean? Have you ever noticed yourself thinking, if I had a friend in my life who was telling me things like this or leading me places like that, I would stop being friends. But it's in here, and in the noticing, and the not participating, and the letting it go. And we draw back into the presence of God. We ask for forgiveness when we need it. This is repentance. We let go. And so at the risk of vastly oversimplifying a 1,000-year history, which, it's kind of what history is. A vast oversimplification. I think we see two paths emerging here. In the West, there's the way of gratitude and the way of worship for what Jesus has done for us, for being the way maker. And in the East, there's this way of active participation in the life of God. The East seems to set its focus on what it is that we are made for, where this journey completes in union. And the West seems to be a bit more cognizant or aware of where it is that we're coming from, the places where we've been trapped, the mistakes that we've made, the shame, the guilt we've been freed from. It's free from or freed for seems to be the emphasis. And so I think most of us grew up in the West, right? Here in the Western world. I just want to talk for just a second to, in conclusion, because of our familiarity and how we grew up and the ideas that we were taught and the feelings that we have, is that you can't avoid the influence of the culture that you grew up in. None of us can. There's that little parable of these two young fish are swimming along, and this old fish swims by, and he says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two fish look at him, they swim on a little bit, and then the one young fish says to the other, "What the hell's water?" It's like, we don't know. We don't know that we're in it, and until we start to recognize it. And then we don't know how deeply it's in us until we start looking for it. And so we just have to weigh what we find in ourselves against the scriptures, against the presence of the Holy Spirit within us as we sort all this stuff out in community with each other. And as we do, we start to notice where those places of influence are in the culture, and we can keep what's helpful and we can let go of what isn't. And so I just want to talk really quick about this way of participation. I kind of want to try to make this concrete if I can. And this is part 3. It's the way of participation. I think we could also call the pattern of resurrection, or what a resurrection really feels like. If you check out Philippians 3, 9 through 12, you see St. Paul name what seems to be a pattern of resurrection. He says, I want to know the power. First he says, I want to know Christ. And I want to join in his suffering. It's a strange thing to ask for. That I might also know the power of the resurrection. That I might attain to the experience, to the knowing, to the living of this new life. So, the pattern of resurrection, the way a resurrection feels, is first, there's this desire, openness, willingness to join in suffering. Here's a decent definition for suffering. Suffering is whenever we're not in control. Suffering is whenever we're not in control. Seems like a pretty good working definition there. And so because of this surrender of control, even if we willfully decide this is probably the best path, it still hurts. And if it's something that we really care about, it feels like death. And this is the pattern. It's the surrender of control. But as we participate in the pattern of resurrection in these little ways, we begin to see that suffering actually is necessary. Because it can teach us how to see beyond our illusion of control, because all the control is, we're just kidding ourselves. Like, you know when it really hurts and you realize that you were pretending the whole time? That life could go on forever like this. You know what I mean? This sort of like, that's why people say, man, I find it odd that disillusionment would have a negative connotation. We don't want to be disillusioned, but we kind of do want to be disillusioned. Suffering is one of the only ways that we can begin to see beyond our illusion of control. And as we do this, we learn to let go, and as we let go, we find out we've been held the whole time. When my grandma passed away, we found this note with her stuff after she passed away, and it said, among other things, "I'm not afraid of death, but I am afraid of dying." And she wasn't afraid of where the passage led, but the passage itself had her concerned. I think this is true. This is a spiritual truth as much as it is a physical truth. We long for resurrection. We want new life, but we're a little bit afraid of the passage that leads there. So part of us has a sense that this might hurt. But in time, as we trust, as we surrender, we begin to realize that we're actually saved, that salvation comes, that we receive it, that we experience it, that we live it. Our salvation, our healing, our wholeness. It actually comes by embracing, all right, this is a couple practical, by embracing our weakness instead of masking it, by acknowledging our wounds instead of running from them, by offering or receiving forgiveness instead of withholding it. All these things feel a little bit like control, power. By giving generously instead of hanging on tightly. By seeking understanding to understand the other before we feel the need to be understood ourselves. All of these things feel like a surrender of control, because they are. Here's the tricky thing about control, and I'll finish with this. We cannot maintain the illusion of control without also maintaining the illusion of separation. And so the only way to experience what it is that we have been promised, what it is that's happening here for us, wholeness, salvation, the way we experience it is by letting go. And we choose this always right now. Like every moment is the doorway into freedom. Like I was baptized like 7 times. I don't know why. I don't know which one worked. Or if I need an 8th, I don't know. But what I've come to believe and to experience and to know to be true is like the baptism moment. Like there are big moments, you know? There are big moments of surrender. And they're easier to identify than the little ones that we're invited to participate in every moment. But it's like to be baptized now. See with new eyes. Let go. So that is the invitation. And we have just a couple of minutes left. So you guys got babies and kids, and if you got to go, I understand. You won't get to hear the other 9 points I have here, but that's all right. I can get you the document. See you cringing up there, Jess. I'll stop with the jokes. We don't want to open the communion tables to anybody who would like to come and receive. There are elements available on either side that are prepackaged. You can grab those. And I will also open this up. Now is the time for reflection. You can sit with what it is that you felt to be true. You can talk to or pray with those around you. You can come up to receive communion. You know, honestly, you can do whatever you want. But service is officially over. Thank you for being here. Be blessed. Go in the peace of the Lord. Amen.